They were left in the snow, like forgotten luggage. Two silent children watching the taillights of the woman who was supposed to love them. But one man saw them and didn't turn away. What began as an act of compassion would ignite a chain of miracles that no one, especially him, could have imagined. If stories of hope, healing, and the quiet power of kindness speak to your soul, consider subscribing. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now let me tell you the story of the day everything changed. The snow wasn't falling, it was slicing. Sharp sideways flurries danced like needles through the bitter wind, blanketing the remote gas station on Route 41, with a silence that wasn't peaceful, but heavy. It was the kind of silence that warned you something is about to break. Silas Danner shifted the truck into park and let the engine idle, his breath clouding the windshield. He glanced toward the passenger seat, where his son Rowan sat, hunched in his winter coat. Face turned toward the window, but eyes unfocused. The boy hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since the accident, not since the light left his eyes. Silas reached across Rowan to turn up the heat. "Won't be long," he murmured, even though he knew Rowan wouldn't respond. He was just about to open his door when a noise outside caught his attention. Not a sound, really, but the movement of people, a cluster of figures gathered at the edge of the lot, all watching the same thing. He followed their gazes. A rusty pickup truck had skidded to a stop in front of the convenience store. The driver's side door swung open, and a thin woman emerged, early 40s, maybe the wear and weather made her look older. Her hair was tangled beneath a beanie cigarette smoke curling from her lips. She moved to the back of the truck, opened the door, and pulled out 2 children. Twins, Silas realized, boy and girl, maybe 8 years old. Their clothes were mismatched, too thin for the weather. The girl wore slippers instead of boots. The boy clutched a threadbare backpack like it was the only solid thing in his world. Then the woman stepped back. She didn't hold them, didn't kneel or cry. She simply muttered something under her breath, turned on her heel, and got back in the truck. Silas sat frozen as the truck peeled out its tires, spinning briefly on the ice before disappearing down the road. The children didn't chase after it. The boy stared ahead, lips tight. The girl looked dazed, like she'd forgotten where her body ended, and the cold began. The snow began piling on their shoulders, their hair, their feet. A man in a flannel coat stepped forward from the cluster of bystanders and said, "Can't believe she just left them here, like strays." "Some people don't deserve to have kids," another added. Then they all stood still. No one moved, not even to help. Silas blinked once, then twice. He opened the door. The wind nearly knocked him back. He yanked his collar high and stepped out, crossing the lot in wide, certain strides, boots crunching the snow with each step. The boy saw him first and stiffened. The girl took a half step backward. Silas slowed, crouched, and took off his scarf. He wrapped it around the girl's neck gently, like he was warming a bird that might fly away if startled. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." No one else had moved. Silas looked over his shoulder, but the crowd was already dispersing. Watching was easier than doing. He turned back to the children. "My name's Silas. I'm not here to hurt you. I've got a truck, some soup in a thermos, and a fire that's not too stubborn." He smiled, but not too wide, not too fast. The boy stared at him like he was made of ice. The girl tilted her head. "Are you a dad?" Silas swallowed. "I used to be," he said. "Still am, I guess. My son's waiting in the truck. He doesn't talk much, but he's a good kid." The wind howled around them, and that was enough. The boy took the girl's hand, and they followed Silas without another word. Inside the truck, Rowan didn't flinch as the door opened, and the cold rushed in. He looked at the 2 snow-covered children climbing into the back seat and blinked slowly. The girl whispered, "Hi." The boy said nothing. Rowan turned to the window again. Silas shut the door and cranked the heat, setting the thermos between the children. "You can warm your hands on this," he offered. "Soup's still hot." The boy nodded. "Barely." Silas didn't press further. As he steered the truck back toward the tree-lined road that led to his cabin, the snow thickened. The trees bent under the weight of it. The sky darkened, like it knew something only the earth could feel. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The twins were huddled together now, her head on his shoulder, his eyes half closed, silent but not afraid. Not anymore. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their stories. But in that moment, Silas Danner knew one thing for certain. No child should ever be left behind in the snow. Not while he was still breathing. The road to Silas's cabin wasn't paved. It was a narrow cut through snowdrifts flanked by pine trees, heavy with white. The truck's tires crunched over the packed ice as twilight deepened into something darker, quieter. Even the engine seemed to hush, as though it knew it was carrying something fragile in the back seat. Silas kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The twins hadn't said much since they got in. The boy, still stiff, still guarded, kept one arm around his sister. The girl had accepted the scarf and soup, but said nothing more. They weren't asleep, but they weren't exactly awake either. It was a kind of numbness Silas recognized all too well. Rowan sat in silence beside him. His face was turned toward the window, but Silas could feel him listening, sensing, taking it all in even if he couldn't or wouldn't speak. They reached the cabin just as night fell. It wasn't much to look at, a small structure of weathered cedar and rusted tin tucked behind a frozen creek. But the porch light glowed warm through the storm, and a faint wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. Silas parked the truck and turned off the engine. The silence that followed felt deep, like a pause between heartbeats. "All right," he said softly. "We're home." Inside the cabin exhaled warmth. Silas kept the wood stove going nearly all winter. It wasn't modern or fancy, but it was reliable like him. The air smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon thanks to a potpourri bag his late wife had left behind years ago. He hadn't thrown it out. The twins stepped in cautiously, their snow-caked boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. The girl looked around wide-eyed as if expecting someone to tell her to leave. The boy scanned the room like he was searching for the exit. Silas helped them out of their jackets and offered dry blankets. He hung their soaked coats near the fire and set out 4 bowls of soup. No one spoke, not even Rowan. But something subtle shifted when they sat at the table. Rowan, always silent and withdrawn, reached for the bread first and then passed it to the girl. Their fingers didn't touch, but for a brief second, their eyes did. And she smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was quiet and unsure, but it was a start. Later after dinner, Silas brought the children upstairs. The cabin had 3 small bedrooms, one for him, one for Rowan, and a spare that had sat empty since the accident. That room still held a dresser full of old clothes his wife couldn't bring herself to donate. He hadn't been able to move them either. He pushed open the door, the hinges creaking. The air smelled like cedar and something long forgotten. "You two can take this room," he said, clearing a pile of folded quilts from the bed. "There's only one bed, but I'll set up another mattress tomorrow. For tonight. This should be okay." The boy nodded, barely perceptible. Silas gave them one last look. 2 tiny figures wrapped in blankets too big, sitting stiffly on the edge of a bed that didn't yet feel like theirs, and then he closed the door. Downstairs, Rowan was sitting near the fire, sketching in his notebook. Silas watched from the doorway. The drawings were always abstract shapes, patterns, sometimes broken lines, that never quite touched. But tonight, Silas noticed something new. 3 small circles, one slightly larger, all surrounded by waves, like they were floating together. He walked over and sat beside his son, not too close. "You all right?" he asked gently. Rowan didn't look up. But he kept drawing. "They won't stay forever," Silas added. "Just until we figure things out." Still no reply, but Rowan's pencil slowed. "I know change is hard, kiddo. But maybe this time it's a good kind of hard." Rowan's fingers paused. Then slowly he drew a fourth circle. Silas smiled and said nothing more. That night, after the kids had fallen asleep, Silas sat by the fire with a mug of old instant coffee and stared into the orange glow. The cabin was quiet, save for the ticking of the stove and the distant moan of wind through the trees. He thought about the moment he'd seen them, those two little bodies in the snow, abandoned by someone who should have protected them. He thought about Rowan 3 years ago, screaming in a hospital bed, and then falling into silence. And he thought about how tonight in one dinner, one small gesture of shared bread, something had cracked open just a little. In the upstairs room, Lark lay awake. She wasn't afraid. Not quite. But her body still tensed with every unfamiliar creak of the house. Cedar was asleep beside her, one arm flung protectively across her middle. She looked across the room at the dresser. There was a photo on top, dusty, but visible, of a woman with soft eyes and a hand resting on a young boy's shoulder. The same boy who sat silent at dinner. The same man who'd carried them through the snow. She didn't know why she trusted them, but she did. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe maybe this house wouldn't send them away. Maybe this house had a heart. The next morning, the snow had softened. Not melted. Montana winters didn't grant that kind of mercy in January, but the wind had quieted, and the sky, once an endless gray bruise, now held the pale promise of sunlight behind sheer clouds. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the wood stove lingered like an invisible blanket hugging the rooms. Silas was up before dawn as always. The scent of frying eggs and toast drifted through the hallways, accompanied by the familiar scrape of metal on cast iron. He didn't expect the twins to be awake yet, but when he passed the hallway, leading to the spare room, he paused. The door was open. Lark sat cross-legged on the floor, a pile of paper and a stubby pencil beside her. Cedar still slept, curled under the patchwork quilt. The girl's face was tilted in concentration as she folded a small square of paper over and over with careful hands. Silas knocked softly on the doorframe. Lark looked up, not startled, not afraid, just calm. "Ready?" "Morning," he said. She nodded. Then quietly she handed him what she'd made. It was a small paper crane wing spread. The folds weren't perfect, but there was something oddly graceful about it. Silas turned it over in his hand. "Did you make this for me?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "For your son," she whispered. Later that morning, Silas set the crane on the edge of Rowan's breakfast plate. The boy, still groggy from sleep, stared at it without touching his food. Then he picked it up, turned it once. Again. Lark watched from across the table, eyes steady. Rowan glanced up at her. Just once, then gently set the crane beside his cup and reached for a piece of toast. Silas didn't say a word, but inside something bloomed. It was beginning. That afternoon, while Silas chopped firewood behind the cabin, Lark approached Rowan where he sat, drawing by the window. She didn't speak, didn't sit too close. Just placed a blank sheet of paper next to his and drew a soft spiral in one corner. Then she slid the pencil toward him. Rowan stared at it. Then after a moment he drew a second spiral, this one reversed, curling toward hers. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. A new language was being born, one of shapes and lines and breathless stillness between two children who knew what it meant to carry too much silence. That evening, Silas sat by the fire with a mug of tea, flipping through an old woodworking manual. He could hear the soft scuff of feet above him, Lark and Cedar getting ready for bed. Rowan sat nearby, pencil in hand, sketching. When he finished, he silently handed the paper to Silas. Silas studied it. 4 small circles sat in the middle of the page, one slightly larger, all linked by curved lines that wove like branches. A 5th shape hovered above them, a crane. He looked at his son. Rowan didn't smile, but he met his father's eyes and gave a single tiny nod. Silas cleared his throat. "Well," he said, voice rough, "I guess we're gonna need a bigger table." The next few days passed in quiet rhythm. Cedar Ever the builder helped Silas reinforce the porch railing and fix the back door latch. He didn't say much, but his focus was impressive. He worked like someone who needed things to hold, needed the world to stop falling apart. Lark spent most of her time inside folding. Paper stars, butterflies, more cranes. She began tucking them in unexpected places on the windowsill on top of Silas's tool chest, beneath Rowan's pillow. They were never labeled, never explained. But each one carried something you couldn't write. One snowy afternoon, a knock sounded on the cabin door. Silas opened it to find a woman in her 60s, with thick glasses and a woven scarf, cheeks pink from the cold. It was Mrs. Delaney, the closest thing the town had to a welcome committee or a neighborhood watchdog, depending on her mood. "I brought stew," she said briskly, holding up a covered pot. "Saw you had little ones. Figured you might not have time to cook proper." Silas blinked. "That's very kind. Don't read too much into it," she muttered, brushing past him. "Just tired of hearing you nearly burn down the kitchen." Rowan watched from the stairs. Lark peeked around the corner. Cedar followed silently behind her, wary. Mrs. Delaney eyed them all, then handed the stew to Lark. "You're the quiet one," she said, not unkindly. Lark nodded once. "Good. Too many talkers in the world." She turned to leave, then paused. "I like the cranes." Silas raised an eyebrow. "You've seen them." She nodded. "One on my mailbox, another in the grocery cart last week." She looked at Lark. "Keep folding, honey. The world needs more softness." That night, as the snow fell again, gentle this time, Lark sat at the table with Rowan. They folded together. She made a dove. He made a star. And when Silas walked in, Rowan looked up, and for the first time in over a year, spoke. "Her name," he said, voice soft and unused, "is Lark." Silas froze. Rowan's lips trembled slightly, but he met his father's gaze. "She made the snow. Quieter." And then he picked up his pencil and drew a new shape on the page, a heart. Not perfect, not symmetrical, but unmistakably whole. The wind picked up again that week, sharp and biting, as if winter had remembered something it was angry about. Silas wrapped another layer around his neck as he stepped outside to chop more wood. The stack beside the porch was shrinking fast. With 4 mouths to feed and 3 rooms to keep warm, the firewood disappeared faster than he could split it. As he swung the axe down onto a log, he heard the soft creak of the cabin door behind him. Cedar stood there bundled in a mismatched coat and scarf, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "You looking to help?" Silas asked, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his flannel. Cedar nodded once. He didn't say much. Rarely did. But his silence was different from Rowan's. It wasn't trauma-locked or hesitant. It was watchful, practiced. Like he'd long since learned that listening could save more than talking ever could. Silas handed him a lighter piece of wood and a hatchet. "Don't need to split it, just take the bark off." Cedar nodded again, then got to work. His motions were careful, precise, not rushed. Within minutes, Silas had to stop pretending he wasn't impressed. "You've done this before." Cedar shrugged. "A little." "Back when?" He trailed off. Silas didn't ask him to finish. Instead, they worked in companionable quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when 2 people are comfortable enough to share space without filling it. Later that day, Cedar asked to explore the shed behind the cabin. "It's just old junk," Silas warned. "Broken furniture, tools I haven't fixed." "I like old junk," Cedar said simply. Silas unlocked the door and let him wander. A few minutes later, he returned inside with a busted table leg, a roll of copper wire, and an old flashlight. He spread the pieces across the kitchen table like a puzzle only he could see. Rowan watched silently from the couch. Lark leaned over his shoulder, fascinated. "What are you building?" Silas asked. Cedar didn't look up. A signal. A signal for Rowan. Silas exchanged a look with Lark, but she only nodded as if this made perfect sense. That night, with Silas's permission, Cedar stayed up late. He sat cross-legged on the floor, crafting in the flickering firelight. When he finished, he held up a small wooden contraption, a simple wheel with feathered edges mounted on a stick. When you spun it, it made a soft hum, low and rhythmic like a heartbeat made of wind. He handed it to Rowan. Rowan didn't touch it at first. Then he reached out, took it carefully, and began to spin. The hum filled the room, not loud, not sharp, but steady, present. Rowan placed it beside him where the paper crane still sat on his nightstand. Then he looked at Cedar and nodded. The next morning, Rowan placed a sketch on the kitchen table. It showed a boy standing on a snowy hill, arms outstretched, 2 wooden wings strapped to his back. Cedar picked it up and smiled, a real smile this time, not just polite or cautious. Something inside him opened just a little. "Thanks," he said. Rowan didn't answer with words. He just folded another crane. Over the following days, the boys grew closer in quiet, extraordinary ways. Cedar built more devices, tiny mobiles that turned in the draft wind chimes, made from bottle caps, a small lantern from an old jam jar, and a strip of LED lights he found in a junk drawer. He didn't do it for attention. He didn't even announce it. He just made things. And Rowan noticed. He placed sketches beside each new creation. Sometimes they were almost technical designs for improvements. Other times they were more abstract. Cedar as a tree with wires for branches, a heart glowing in the trunk. Silas watched it all unfold, like someone witnessing an ancient dance he couldn't quite name. Those two, he said to Lark one evening as they prepared dinner. "They're speaking a language nobody taught them." Lark smiled. Maybe they didn't need to be taught. Maybe they just needed a place to speak. One night the power went out. It wasn't uncommon in rural Montana, and winter didn't mix well, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The stove flickered out. The lights dimmed. The backup generator sputtered and died. The cabin fell into deep darkness. Lark lit candles. Silas stoked the fire. But Rowan sat rigid in his chair, hands clenched. His breathing had grown shallow, and his eyes stared into a corner that wasn't there. Cedar saw it first. He stood up and grabbed the humming wheel. Then he knelt in front of Rowan and spun it. The hum returned. Soft. Steady. Rowan's fingers loosened. His shoulders dropped. The tension faded from his face like frost, melting from a window. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The next day, Cedar climbed onto the porch roof with Silas's permission and installed his first homemade wind spinner, a little wooden propeller designed to turn in the mountain breeze and send soft vibrations through the wall. Rowan slept soundly that night, and every night after. The knock on the cabin door came just as the afternoon sun broke through a curtain of low-hanging clouds, casting long, golden rays across the snowbanks like it was trying to apologize for weeks of bitter cold. Silas wiped his hands on a dish towel and opened the door. There she was, Eloan Graves, bundled in a forest green coat hair, tucked neatly beneath a wool cap, clipboard, in one hand, a thermos in the other. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, but her eyes soft. Hazel flecked with something unreadable were focused steady. Silas hadn't seen her since the day at the gas station. Back then, she'd stood in the doorway of that diner, coffee forgotten in her hand, watching him scoop up 2 abandoned children and walk into a storm like it was the most natural thing in the world. Now she smiled, almost shyly. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Silas said. "We were just finishing lunch. I brought tea," she added, lifting the thermos. "Chamomile and ginger. For the kids, mostly. But you look like you could use some, too." Silas stepped aside. "Come on in." The cabin looked warmer than she remembered less, like a place where grief had taken root, and more like a house that had decided it still had something to offer. Lark and Rowan sat at the table folding cranes side by side. Cedar knelt by the stove, adjusting the fire like a seasoned woodsman. Rowan looked up at Elo and blinked, once then returned to his folding. Eloan's eyebrows lifted. "He looks better." Silas nodded. "He's been sleeping through the night. That's a big deal. You have no idea." She walked to the table and gently placed the thermos between the children. "Hot tea. Not too sweet, just like my dad used to make." Lark smiled politely and poured some into a mug. She handed it to Rowan without a word. He accepted it. Eloan turned back to Silas, voice low. "Mind if I ask how things are going?" "Officially sure." "You want the truth or the government-approved version?" Both, she said with a grin. They talked in the kitchen, while the kids played a quiet game of snowflake dominoes Lark had invented, with folded paper and colored dots. Silas explained how he was managing working remote carpentry gigs, stretching savings, getting some help from Mrs. Delaney, who now dropped off stew every Thursday without fail. "She still calls me that fool with too many hearts and not enough plans," Silas said. "But she adds extra carrots in the stew now, so I take it as affection." Eloan chuckled, then her voice softened. "I've read a lot of case files, Silas, and I've visited a lot of homes. Most don't look like this. Like what? Like hope lives here." Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the kids. Lark had just handed Rowan a folded swan. Cedar was carving something from a piece of pine, concentrated quiet, completely present. He turned back to Eloan. "I'm not qualified to do this." She tilted her head. "Who is, I mean, legally, maybe I'll get there. But emotionally, financially," he exhaled. "I'm just a guy trying not to mess up more than I already have." "You're not. You don't know that." "I do," she said, her voice firm now. "Because those children aren't flinching. They aren't shrinking. They're blooming. That doesn't happen in houses where love is uncertain." Silas swallowed hard. He wasn't a man who cried easily, but something about her tone, soft, sure, without pity, struck a place in him he thought had sealed shut years ago. Later that afternoon, as the sky dipped into twilight, Silas invited her to stay for dinner. Eloan hesitated. "I have other stops," she said. "Other homes." He nodded. "Of course. But," she added, eyes flicking to the window where Rowan and Lark were tracing snow patterns with their fingertips, "maybe those homes can wait an hour." So she stayed. They ate venison stew and biscuits with too much butter. Cedar asked a question about helicopter rescue work, and Eloan surprised them all with a detailed explanation she'd done a ride-along once during training. Rowan listened closely, even smiled once. After dinner, Silas walked her to the door. The stars were already out bright and sharp in the cold night sky. She turned to him, her breath fogging between them. "Do you ever feel like maybe you didn't choose this life, but it chose you?" Silas looked up at the cabin. Through the window, he saw Lark pinning another crane to the curtain rod. Rowan sat beside her, holding the one she'd given him first. "I feel that way every day," he said. She lingered a moment. "Then maybe it's time to stop asking whether you're enough and start accepting that you were exactly who they needed." Silas didn't respond. But as she walked away, snow crunching beneath her boots, he stood a little taller. Not because someone believed in him, but because maybe for the first time in years, he believed in himself. Willowbend wasn't the kind of town where things happened quietly. It was a place where fences were low, porches were wide, and blinds were more often cracked than drawn. Gossip didn't need a starting gun. It only needed a whisper, and someone with a cup of coffee and time to kill. When Silas Danner brought home 2 strange children during the snowstorm, the town didn't rush to intervene, but it noticed. It watched. From curtained windows and corner booths at the diner, from pews in the church and lines at the post office. At first, the talk was wary. 3 kids now. With his history, where's the mother? You think social services knows. Poor boy already has enough with that quiet one. What's he thinking? But as days passed, and the children weren't seen shivering on the porch or crying in the store. As Lark held the door open at the bakery and Cedar offered to fix the broken latch at the community center, the tone shifted. Slowly, grudgingly. One morning, Silas came out to find a neatly folded note stuck under the windshield wiper of his truck. Inside was a handwritten message. Heard the boy likes to build. I've got spare tools and extra scrap wood. If he wants it, it's his. M. Delaney attached was a phone number and a smiley face that looked more like a bent nail. Silas smiled. He hadn't expected May Delaney, queen of opinionated whispers, to be the first to extend a hand. But maybe that was the magic of kindness. Once it took root, it grew in unlikely places. Word spread. By the end of the week, a box of new coats showed up at the front door. No note, just the tags still on. Then came a bundle of children's books from the library tied with twine. A week later, the church pianist dropped off a used but tuned ukulele with a sticky note, in case someone has music in them, but no instrument to let it out. Lark started playing with it in the evenings, strumming gentle, uncertain chords by the fire. Rowan, for the first time, began sketching sound waves, echoes, spirals of feeling. Even Cedar, who rarely smiled for the sake of it, seemed lighter. Freer, but not everyone approved. One afternoon at the hardware store, Silas overheard 2 men near the paint aisle. Taking in strangers like that makes you look like you're trying to prove something, or hide something. Silas said nothing, but he bought the paint 2 gallons of sun-warmed yellow, not because the house needed it, but because it felt like time for something brighter. That Saturday they painted the porch together. Cedar took the corners. Lark stood on a crate to reach the eaves. Rowan helped by labeling the paint cans in his own made-up system, symbols only he and Cedar seemed to understand. They laughed. They dripped. They got more paint on themselves than on the wood. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The next morning, Silas stood sipping his coffee when a car pulled into the driveway. It was Alawan. She stepped out with a clipboard and a box of groceries. Technically, she said with a wry smile, "I'm here for a progress check." Unofficially, I brought apples and real maple syrup. Progress is measured in pancakes, now, Silas asked. Always has been. She walked through the cabin, slowly asking questions, jotting notes. She noticed the paper cranes still multiplying. The mobile Cedar had built from kitchen utensils that now hung above the staircase, the ukulele perched beside the couch, the freshly painted porch. And most of all, she noticed Rowan. He was sitting at the table sketching, Lark beside him, Cedar across. All 3 leaned together, heads bowed like petals in bloom. "They're a unit," she murmured. Silas stood beside her, arms crossed. "Took some doing. Still a work in progress." "Aren't we all?" She turned to him. "You know, some towns let people change. Others only ever see what they remember." And Willow Bend Alawan smiled. They're still watching. But now, they're watching with hope. That evening, as snow began to fall again, Lark pinned a new crane to the window. On its wings, she'd written in tiny, careful script, "Not everyone who watches is waiting to judge. Some are waiting to learn how to love again." It was Sunday morning, and Silas had decided to bake. Not out of obligation, and certainly not out of skill. He'd never been more than a passable cook, the kind of man who measured flour by instinct and poured milk like he was fueling an engine. But Lark had been talking about real bread the night before, the kind that smells like a hug, and something in the way she said it made Silas want to try. The kitchen filled with clatter and flour dust. Cedar helped measure ingredients with the exactitude of an engineer, while Rowan silently illustrated each step in his notebook bowl. Spoon heat time. Lark tied a dish towel around her head like a baker's hat and proclaimed herself the official dough whisperer. She leaned over the mixing bowl, humming softly, hands moving like a girl who hadn't been afraid of play in a long time. It should have been perfect. But then Silas forgot to set the timer. The smell came slowly, at first, faint, toasty, promising, then too dark, then unmistakable burned. He yanked open the oven, wincing as a rush of smoke spilled into the room. The bread was blackened on top, the crust hard as stone. Silas cursed under his breath and slammed the door shut. He sat down hard at the table, defeated. I ruined it. Cedar inspected the loaf like a scientist. Edges are gone. Middle might still be okay. Rowan sketched a cartoon flame beside the drawing of the loaf and held it up. Lark giggled. Silas looked up, blinking. You're laughing. It's memorable, she said. He raised an eyebrow. Memorably bad. Memorably ours. She cut into the middle of the loaf with careful hands and pulled out a warm golden slice. Still soft inside, she said, just like us. Silas let out a surprised chuckle, the tension loosening from his shoulders. They sat at the table eating imperfect bread with too much butter, the crust scraped, the middle devoured. It wasn't beautiful, but it was enough. More than enough. Later that afternoon, Lark disappeared for a while into the spare bedroom. Silas didn't ask. She'd begun doing that occasionally, retreating into silence, into thought. But when she emerged, she was holding something. A scarf. It was clumsily knitted, the edges uneven, but it was long and soft and unmistakably handmade. Strands of blue and gray and pale yellow woven together like seasons, finding peace in one another. This was your wife's yarn, right? She asked. Silas blinked. Yeah. How did you? It still smelled like lavender, like that old bag in the top drawer. He felt his breath catch. She was going to make a scarf, Lark added. There was a half-started one all unraveled. I used it. She held it out. I think you should have it. Silas didn't speak. He took the scarf in both hands and pressed it gently to his face. The scent, so faint, almost imagined, hit him like a wave. Lavender. Memory. Love. That night, Silas wore the scarf while sitting beside the fire. Rowan leaned against him, flipping through his sketch pad. Lark worked on a new crane, this one larger, with wings twice the size of the others. Cedar fiddled with a makeshift lantern, trying to adjust the way the light flickered against the cabin walls. Outside, snow was falling again softly, this time more like feathers than punishment. There was a peace in the room, not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind born of people choosing to be there. A chosen stillness. Much later, when the kids were asleep, Silas stepped outside wrapped in the scarf. He looked out at the snow-covered yard, the porch newly painted, the roof lined with hand-crafted wind chimes Cedar had designed. The cabin behind him glowed faintly with firelight. He heard footsteps. Turning, he saw Eloan walking up the path, bundled in her coat, cheeks flushed, boots crunching in the snow. I should have called, she said softly. You didn't have to. She smiled. I couldn't sleep. Thought maybe I'd drop off that packet you asked for resource options for homeschooling. She held up a folder, then hesitated. Also, I just wanted to see them. The way you all fit together. Like a story I keep wanting to reread. Silas stepped aside and let her in. They sat at the table, the scarf still draped around his neck. Alawan looked at it, then looked at him. Did she knit that? No, he said, but she started it, and someone else finished it in the same spirit. Alawan nodded, slowly tracing the edge of her teacup. They love you, she said. Silas looked toward the staircase. I'm still learning how to carry that. You already are. He exhaled. Do you ever feel like life gave you a second chance but didn't give you a manual? She smiled. All the time. They didn't say anything for a long while. The fire popped once. Then Alawan asked quietly, Can I tell you something that might be too honest? Please. I think this house, this family, it's not just healing them, it's healing you too. Silas stared into the flames, eyes glassy but dry. I hope so, he whispered, because deep down he wanted to believe that even broken people could bake new bread, that even uneven stitches could make something warm, that sometimes the thing you burned didn't matter as much as the love you wrapped it in. It was the kind of morning that looked calm, but felt uneasy. The snow had paused the sky, a pale stretch of gray, still and watchful. Silas stood on the porch with a mug of coffee, his breath curling in the cold air, watching the birds peck at the feeder Cedar had rigged from an old tin can. He didn't notice the car until it turned onto the long dirt road, tires crunching through snow and ice, moving slow, hesitant, almost apologetic. It wasn't local. Too polished. Too silent. He squinted, heart tightening before his mind caught up. Something in the way it crept toward the house felt wrong, familiar in a way he didn't want to remember. When it stopped at the bottom of the drive, he recognized the woman before the door opened. Maeve. She stepped out carefully, as if the ground might break beneath her. Her coat was expensive, tan wool neatly belted, but didn't hide the sharpness of her frame. The wear around her eyes, the twitch of her jaw. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then she took a step forward. Silas, she said, voice hoarse. I'm not here to cause trouble. He didn't answer. His jaw clenched. I need to see them, she said. Just once. I'm not here to take them back. I swear it. The door creaked open behind him. Lark stood in the doorway, small and still. Cedar appeared behind her, and Rowan, too, drawn by the stillness that had settled over the house like fog. Maeve's gaze flicked upward and softened, then shattered. She hadn't seen them since that day in the snow. They were taller now, thicker in the shoulders, but the eyes, those wide, wary, too old eyes, were the same. Lark took a single step forward. Maeve opened her mouth, but no words came. So Silas stepped aside. I won't make this decision for them. The silence that followed was one of the longest moments Silas could remember. Time didn't move. Even the wind held its breath. Then Lark walked down the steps, not rushed, not afraid. She stopped a few feet from Maeve, close enough to see the fine lines around her mouth, the tremble of her fingers. Maeve opened her purse and pulled something out, a scarf. Bright pink, child-sized, worn at the corners. I kept this, she said, voice cracking. From before things got bad, before I lost myself. Lark didn't take it, but she didn't walk away. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, one of her folded paper cranes, pale blue wings, tight, sharp-edged, but delicate. She held it out. I don't want to remember the snow, she said quietly but clearly, but I do want to remember how it ended. Maeve took the crane like it might crumble in her palm. She looked at Lark, at Cedar, then at Silas. Thank you, she said, for doing what I couldn't. She turned to leave. Before she reached the car, Lark spoke again. I hope you get warm. Maeve stopped. Then she nodded once, tucked the crane into her coat pocket, and drove away. Inside, Silas wasn't sure what to say. He was used to fixing things with his hands, loose boards, jammed locks, broken chair legs. But some moments didn't need fixing. They needed space. Lark returned to the table without a word and picked up her next piece of paper. Cedar went back to sketching a birdhouse he planned to build. Rowan slid closer to the fire and unfolded the sketch he'd been working on that morning, a girl standing in the snow, offering a bird to a faceless figure. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something close. That evening, Elowen arrived unannounced. Silas met her on the porch, still wearing the scarf Lark had made. She came, he said. Elowen didn't need to ask who. She asked for nothing, he continued, just to see them. And they let her. Elowen stepped closer. How did it go? He exhaled slowly. It didn't go. It just was. Sometimes that's the best we can hope for. They went inside together. Rowan looked up from the floor where he was piecing together a puzzle made from mismatched shapes and salvaged wood scraps. He gave Elowen a small nod. Lark handed her a cup of tea without being asked. Cedar held up his latest design, and Silas watched them all. How did this happen? He whispered mostly to himself. Elowen looked at him. You didn't rescue them, Silas. You received them. He blinked. What's the difference? One is an act of pity, she said. The other is an act of love. That night, Lark wrote something on a new crane before pinning it to the window. Silas found it hours later after the kids had gone to sleep. In her small, neat handwriting she'd written, I didn't forget who she was, but I'm starting to remember who I am. He stood there for a long while, the quiet pressing against the windows like snow. Then he took the scarf from around his neck, placed it gently on the chair by the fire, and sat beside it. Not because he needed to feel warmer, but because he already did. February came in slow and gray, a hushed kind of cold that settled deep in the bones. The days grew longer by inches, not hours, and the snow didn't melt so much as it compacted, pressing down layer by layer like memory. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was steady, and it was real. Rowan had begun speaking in soft, brief sentences, usually just to Lark or Cedar, but sometimes to Silas too. He still preferred drawing to conversation, but his voice had returned not as a storm, but as a whisper that insisted on being heard. Cedar had built his first full birdhouse from scratch and mounted it on a pine just outside Rowan's window. Within 2 days, a pair of chickadees had moved in. And Lark had started singing. Not often and never loudly, but some nights when she thought no one was listening, her voice would rise and fall in fragments. Old hymns, folk, lullabies, melodies. She must have learned long ago and stored in the safest part of her. Silas would stand just outside the doorway and listen, breath caught in his chest. The song was not about perfection. It was about survival. One Sunday morning, Elowen stayed after her check-in visit, helping the kids bake scones, an effort that involved flour on every surface, 3 experimental recipes, and a spoonful of salt where sugar should have gone. Silas watched her laugh with them, her sleeves rolled up a smudge of flour on her cheek. She was different here, softer, as if her professional exterior had peeled away, revealing a woman who'd always been meant for warmth and motion, not forms and folders. She caught him watching, what she said smiling. Nothing Silas said and meant everything. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, they sat on the porch, wrapped in wool blankets, 2 mugs of tea steaming between them. Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you? Elowen asked. Probably that I was crazy. I thought you were brave. Silas looked down at his hands. I wasn't. You were. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know their names. I just saw 2 kids standing in the snow, and he stopped. Elowen waited. I didn't turn away, he said finally. She nodded. That's what made it brave. The next morning, Rowan did something he'd never done before. He asked for help. Silas was in the shed sorting tools when Rowan tapped on the doorframe holding a piece of paper. It was a sketch, 3 people seated around a campfire, a 4th standing nearby, guitar in hand. "Me?" Silas asked, pointing to the guitar player. Rowan nodded. "I haven't played in years." Rowan waited. Silas sighed. "All right, I'll dig it out." It took him over an hour to find it buried under boxes in the attic, his old acoustic dusty, but intact. He tuned it slowly, fingers stiff from disuse, and strummed a few shaky chords. That evening he played by the fire. Just one song, "Take Me Home," Country Roads. A tune so familiar it felt like stepping into a memory. Rowan tapped along with a spoon. Cedar added a soft hum. Lark harmonized under her breath, eyes closed. And when the final chord faded, the silence that followed was full, peaceful, whole. Elowen, sitting quietly by the hearth, said nothing, but her eyes were shining. Days passed. The snow began to melt just slightly. Ice receded from the edges of the roof. Birds returned. The town had begun to accept the children not as a temporary curiosity, but as something that belonged. At the diner, Mrs. Delaney referred to Lark as "my little angel" with the cranes. The librarian set aside nature books for Cedar. Rowan received a letter from a boy his age at church, asking if they could be friends when spring came. Silas felt the change most acutely in himself. He smiled more, slept deeper, cooked with fewer burnt edges, but he still wrestled with something unspoken. And one night, as he walked Elowen to her car beneath a sky filled with stars and melting frost, it finally spilled out. "I didn't plan for this," he said. "Any of it. I didn't ask to be a father again." She turned to him, waiting. "But I don't think I can go back," he admitted. "To before. To being someone who turns away." She reached up, touched the scarf Lark had made for him. "You already changed, Silas, the day you didn't look away." He stepped closer, not bold, but certain. "And what about you?" he asked. "What are you choosing?" She smiled. "To stay a little longer, if that's all right." He exhaled deeply. "It's more than all right." Then, with no ceremony, just the quiet of trust long earned, he kissed her. Softly, slowly, like folding something fragile and beautiful, and finally knowing it wouldn't fall apart. 15 years passed, like the tide, never in a rush, but never still. The cabin changed slowly. The porch was expanded twice. A second wood stove was added. The wallpaper peeled in places, but no one minded. Every nail scratch and coat of paint had a story behind it. So did the people inside. Cedar became a man of few words and big skies. He studied engineering, but what he really lived for were flight patterns, rescue systems, and storm behavior. At 25, he was a licensed pilot, aerial search and rescue stationed 3 hours north, but never missed a weekend visit home. Lark pursued law, but not for money or status. Her memory of being invisible, of being seen as disposable, never left her. She became a juvenile court judge, known across 3 counties for her unwavering fairness and piercing empathy. Rowan became a mystery turned miracle. With a heart both mechanical and poetic, he fused art and therapy into a unique practice, expressive rehabilitation for nonverbal and emotionally withdrawn children. He opened a center bearing no name, just a paper crane carved into the wooden sign. They had grown up in a home that taught them 2 things. You don't leave people in the snow. And love, even when imperfect, can still take flight. Silas, now gray at the temples and slower on the ladder, still kept the fire burning. He still played guitar, only better now. And he still wore that scarf Lark had made, though the stitches had loosened and the colors had faded to comfort. Elowen never left. She'd moved in quietly like snow filling in the gaps around tree roots. She didn't replace the past, she simply became part of the story that continued forward. Her love for Silas was steadfast, never needing a label louder than, "We chose this." They all thought they had weathered the worst. Until the blizzard came. It started like any other Montana snowstorm, expected, inconvenient, fierce. But this one spiraled fast. A rescue operation nearby had gone wrong. Silas, volunteering at the local shelter, left early to help move supplies to a stranded barn. By the time Ilowan realized he hadn't returned, night had fallen and the storm had swallowed the road whole. The call came through Cedar's emergency line. A name, a location, a risk. And without hesitation, Cedar suited up. In the cockpit of the chopper, Cedar flew into wind so sharp it rattled bone. He hadn't flown in conditions this bad since his training days. But this wasn't a drill. This was his father. He located the truck upside down near a frozen creek. Half covered in snow, the cabin lights still blinking dimly. And a figure beside it, huddled unmoving. "Hold on, Dad," he muttered. "I'm here." At the hospital, Silas lay unconscious, a mild concussion and dangerously low body temperature. But he was alive. Cedar sat by the bed all night. In the morning, Lark walked in, wearing her court robe, hair still pulled back from a morning hearing, eyes fierce and wet. She pulled out a piece of paper, a folded letter Silas had written 10 years before. It was his will updated each time one of them reached adulthood. In it, he'd called her a soul made of justice. She never let him forget it. Rowan came next. He didn't speak. He just placed a wooden crane on the nightstand, hand-carved, sanded to silk, the same size as the first one Lark had ever folded. Then he sat beside his father and began sketching the shape of Silas's heartbeat on a monitor. It was uneven, stubborn, still fighting. When Silas opened his eyes 2 days later, the first thing he saw was not the IV, nor the snow drifting outside the window. It was his family. Ilowan's hand in his Rowan beside him, Lark reading aloud a letter from a child they'd never met, and Cedar standing in the doorway, flight suit still dusted in frost. "You didn't think we'd let you go alone, did you?" Cedar asked. Silas blinked. His voice was hoarse. "How many of you flew here? All of us," Lark said. You brought a judge into a storm." "She is the storm," Ilowan murmured, smiling. They all laughed, even Rowan. That evening, when Silas was finally discharged, they wheeled him outside. The sky had cleared. The snow was deep, glittering in moonlight. Outside the hospital, someone had pinned a single paper crane to the handrail. Lark picked it up and read the writing on its wings. He kept the fire warm. "Now it's our turn." She handed it to Silas. He pressed it gently to his chest. Back at the cabin, the wind chimes. Cedar, once built, still moved with the breeze. The curtains danced. The fire roared. They sat around the same table, older, now weathered, but together. Silas looked at them all, his children, not by blood, but by choice, by miracle, by snow and by wings. And he said with a voice full of gravel and grace, "I thought I gave you a home. But all along, you were building one for me." The following spring came earlier than expected. Patches of green poked through the retreating snow. The air no longer bit. It kissed. Birds returned in full chorus, as if they'd never been gone. And on the porch of the Danner cabin, daffodils bloomed in a rusted coffee can Cedar had once sworn he'd turn into a lantern. It was Easter morning, and the entire family, Silas, Ilowan, Rowan, Cedar, and Lark, stood gathered in front of the house, looking out at the town car slowly rolling up the long dirt drive. Rowan stood closest to Silas, one hand resting lightly on his father's shoulder. Lark held a small white box wrapped with twine. Cedar leaned against the railing, arms crossed, smiling quietly. They weren't expecting trouble. They were expecting closure. The door of the car opened, and May Delaney stepped out. Not the sharp-tongued town gossip of 15 years ago, but a woman softer, now older in the eyes, gentler in the stance. She held nothing in her hands, but wore a look of practiced humility, the kind you don't learn from pride, but from time. "Well," she said, looking around. "You painted the porch again." Silas smiled. Lark picked the color. "Of course she did," May said, then exhaled. "I wanted to say thank you for proving us wrong, for proving me wrong." He nodded once. "You weren't the only one watching through curtains." She chuckled. "No, but you were the only one who opened the door." That afternoon they hosted what Elowen called a gathering of gratitude. Not quite a celebration, not quite a party. Just family, a few neighbors' warmth and stories. There was no ceremony, no big speeches. But there was food music and light. Elowen baked 3 kinds of pie. Lark read aloud a letter from a young woman who had grown up in the foster system and called Judge Lark the first person who saw my full name and said it like a promise. Cedar gave a ride in his 2-seater plane to a wide-eyed 12-year-old who wanted to be a pilot. And Rowan. He unveiled something he'd been working on for months. A sculpture carved from old maple beams, salvaged from the original schoolhouse in town. It stood nearly 6 feet tall, 4 abstract figures intertwined, but distinct. At the center, a heart not perfectly shaped, but unmistakable, glowed with a small solar light that pulsed gently as the sun moved. On the base, he'd engraved 5 words: "We are who we shelter." The townspeople stood in quiet awe, some blinking back tears. Mrs. Delaney turned to Silas and whispered, "I think your boy just gave this town a soul." As the sun began to set, Elowen stepped onto the porch and rang an old brass bell she'd found in the attic, once used to call the family in for dinner, now polished and gleaming in the golden light. "Everyone," she said, "we have one more gift." She nodded to Lark, who stepped forward with the white box. Inside was a stack of paper cranes, hundreds of them, each folded by hand over the years, each one bearing a name. Silas, Rowan, Cedar, Elowen, Lark, Maeve, Delaney, even May, even strangers, even those who'd once turned away but later turned toward. Lark explained softly, "We've been keeping these. Each crane represents a moment of love or healing or choosing kindness when it wasn't easy." Then she smiled, radiant full. "We're hanging them from the trees, so this place remembers." And they did. Together, the townsfolk tied strings of cranes between the pines. The trees became stories, the wind a choir. The sky blushed purple as paper wings danced with the breeze, whispering you are not forgotten. Rowan stood beneath the first tree holding a blank crane. He turned to Silas and handed him the final pen. "Right," he said. Silas stared at the empty wing for a long time. Then, with quiet care, he wrote, "The day I didn't turn away, I learned how to come home." That night, the family gathered by the fireplace one last time before bed. The cabin was quieter now, not because it was empty, but because it was full in all the right ways. Silas sat in his favorite chair, Elowen beside him, Rowan curled up with a book of poetry he'd memorized rather than read. Cedar and Lark were preparing to head back to their own lives in the morning, but no one called it leaving anymore, because they always came back. Before turning in, Silas stepped outside one last time. The porch creaked beneath him, familiar and steady. He looked up at the sky. A few flakes floated down, soft and slow. Not a storm, not a threat, just a memory. He thought of that day 15 years ago, the snow, the silence, the tiny hand wrapped in his scarf. He looked toward the woods now hung with hundreds of cranes, and he whispered not to the sky, but to something older and closer. Thank you for choosing me. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Share your city, your country, or just a few words in the comments. You never know who might feel a little less alone by reading what you write. And if you'd like more stories like this, filled with kindness, healing, and hope, feel free to subscribe. We'd be honored to have you as part of this growing community. Thank you truly for spending your time with us today. Your presence means more than you know. Until next time, stay warm, stay kind, and take care.